Welcome once again to Off the Shelf Books on Tour. My guest is Ira Silva, who's a professor at Framingham State, and the book is Giving Hope. Very, very eclectic textbook, good read on a whole bunch of areas. It's well done, very well done, and I like your philosophy. How did you ever settle on trying to make us all smarten up?
I like the way you put it. Well, it's kind of a merger of kind of two ways my career had been going to the point at which I started writing this book. First, I'm a professor of sociology, as you said, and I specialize in the study of inequality. And at a time when social inequalities have been growing so much in our society, and there's been so much media coverage of it, I thought that was one sort of motivator for this book. And the second one was I had for some time been studying charitable giving, kind of from more of an academic standpoint, and I was curious to kind of put my interest in charitable giving and my interest in inequality, kind of put those together and write a book that, as you pointed out, is accessibly written both for students and for kind of general readers as a kind of a guide for how people could give in ways that so that they could be part of a solution to this growing inequality we see in our society, where we're hearing literally day after day stories of people who are trying hard to get ahead and
Going hungry?
simply can't. Hunger, lack of education, lack of access to jobs. And so what this book does is it lays out organizations, both local to the Boston area as well as around the country, that have proven track records of making a difference in
Many of them recognizable, and some of them I never even knew about. But after reading it, if I were a person in dire need of any one of these services, and this was in the bookstore under sociology, would I go looking for it?
Probably not. Well, I don't really consider it a sociology book
Where
per
would it
se.
be in a bookstore or a library?
Right. Well, it'd be under sort of help or charitable giving. That's a
I'd like to hang it from the ceiling and say, look here.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Because it is. It's got so much information, but I don't know how, like leading them to water.
Right.
How would they know that you've worked this hard to put it all together if they don't know what they're looking for?
Well, so here's the thing, Veronica. So as our viewers may or may not know, I mean, giving is something that is kind of a cherished American value. Almost 90% of American households give about $1,700–1,800 a year. And we're not talking about just the big, affluent people who give $1 million gifts. We're talking about most giving comes from people who are actually of modest means. And that's really, I wrote this book for people who have the impulse to give, who are concerned about the way that this country is moving in a direction that is really kind of undermining of its sort of basic tenets of equality of opportunity, and ways in which when people give, they want to connect their gift to some story of obviously of betterment. And here in this book, I've chronicled stories of individuals who have been helped by these organizations that are not particularly well-known or well-understood organizations that are simply providing opportunities. They're not taking the place of people working hard. There's no guarantees of people succeeding, but they do enable in a number of ways people to get a foothold, so that if someone has $10 or $15 or $20 or more to give, these are places that we often don't hear about. These are places that when we see advertisements or we get mail about please give to this or that, most of these organizations are not showing up.
Did you find, as you studied it, that I find in my own life, the people who have received in life, when their parents were down and out, when they were without oil, when somebody dropped off a Thanksgiving dinner, those are the people that are first in line to give now. Like pay it ahead,
Right.
And give back.
Well, it's interesting you asked that because actually the group of the population that is the most generous proportional to what they have are the lowest income Americans.
Yes.
Obviously, in real terms, they don't give as much as the most affluent, but generally, people who have experienced hardship are as committed, if not, like I said, more so to giving. And so, whatever people have to give, whatever their income. I mean, the thing is about this book, it's not so much, it's not written as a kind of, you must do this. It's really
Well,
for
how
people.
you can.
Right. It would seem very kind of. Yeah, I don't think its message would come across well that way. Really, the idea is that we already have this cherished value of giving. We're already concerned about the way opportunity is declining in this country. We hear a tremendous amount about what the government either should or should not, depending on
wrong.
or what they do wrong, depending on one's politics. And that was another motivator for writing this book, is that it's really a way to conceptualize the problem of inequality of opportunity and ways we can address it without getting into the thorny business of whether the government is doing too much, too little, is efficient or inefficient. Because the thing about charitable giving in this country is that there's always been a consensus, going back to the founding of the Republic, a consensus among people across the political spectrum that this is a kind of an appropriate way to deal with problems because it's done privately. It's not done through taxation.
And quietly, I find a gigantic amount of people volunteer.
Absolutely.
And they volunteer for nonprofits, and even the people that work in nonprofits do not get the same paycheck as CEOs. It's very difficult to work in a nonprofit because you're always asking and spending and providing, yet asking and spending. And some of them get paychecks that turn donors off. But the majority in nonprofits are run on a shoestring, so they can give what they get to the people that they represent.
Yeah, and that's another, I guess, misconception that this book tries to highlight and expose, is that we often hear stories about nonprofits that are either being run inefficiently, or there's fraud, or people often talk about what percent of my dollar is going to help the problem versus toward waste. And although it's not a major focal point of the book, and most of the organizations I highlight are pretty efficient in the way they use contributions, I do make the point, and I think it's important for viewers to understand that I think that's in many ways a misleading barometer of what's effective giving, because as you mentioned, salaries are already lower among nonprofits than in the corporate sector. I mean, people who we want good people working in these organizations
and
to help,
dedicated people,
and they
that care, but they
they
have
need-
homes, they
exactly,
have cars,
right.
they have children
Right.
as well. So
Right. So it's I think a little bit of a misconception to see giving as about 100% I want to go to fixing the problem, when nonprofits have lighting bills to pay, they have salaries, that sort of thing. That being said, most of the organizations that I write about are small. They have they're not paying a lot in salaries. They're run heavily based on volunteers. And I should mention, the book, even though we've been talking about giving in monetary terms, the book also highlights with these organizations that there's a lot of voluntary opportunities out there for helping
we
as
spent
well.
a lot of time at Katrina and the devastation, and you saw the inequity between Ward 9 and I saw that myself. It was very important to get the street where they play all the music up and running and the bars open. And yet we both know there's still people who can't return to their homes.
Absolutely, even almost 9 years later. And that was actually, you asked how I got involved in writing this book. It was August of 2005 when Hurricane Katrina struck. It was kind of like connecting the dots for me. As a sociologist who'd been studying inequality for a long time, for many Americans, this event kind of exposed inequality, on our nightly TV broadcast. And yet I was following, and again, I was participating in, maybe you were, others were, millions were participating in this massive aid response. And I was thinking, okay, on the one hand, we've got this disaster that's exposing, inequalities. Some people couldn't leave the city, didn't have the money, et cetera. They
couldn't get out of their own way.
Couldn't get out of their own way. They tended to be lower income, predominantly African American. We had that story on the one hand. On the other hand, we had this massive charitable response. And I was kind of thinking about this. I said, well, these people, although the storm clearly devastated their lives in profound ways, many of them were living in marginal circumstances long before the storm struck. and yet we don't have the kind of the charitable response to that. And so that's really what this book is about, is a way to kind of, for us to see everyday inequalities of opportunity as a disaster akin to what we saw with
I'd
Katrina.
love to see a coordinated effort. I can remember following a trainload of trucks full of water, and we all know how badly the water was needed.
Sure.
And these were refrigerated trucks. And because of the chaos, they couldn't get in.
Absolutely.
So they spent 5 weeks running 24 hours a day in Texas. And then they went to Florida, waiting to get the water, and they wound up in Maine, parked on a vacant field because
Right.
nobody knew what to know. What people put out for that water. People paid for that gas and fuel, the truck drivers, and the water never reached the people.
Right.
That's a bummer.
So in the spirit of what you're describing with Katrina, that it's that same sentiment, that same call to action that I'm aiming with this book, for us to see what happens to so many people on an everyday basis, not because of an act of nature, but because of the way our society and economy has gone, that we view their hardships as akin to a natural disaster, right?
And be a little bit better prepared, one would hope.
Right, and that's why what these organizations are doing is really kind of, they're not responding. You know, we started this conversation talking about hunger, which is obviously a very serious problem, but generally they're not responding to the kind of emergency needs like hunger or homelessness. They're really responding to kind of a more systematic way. In other words, so I have 3 chapters of the book that deal with these systematic responses. One has to do with greater access to high quality early childhood education. Right, with the idea being that there's this tremendous evidence of how much there's a disparity, even by a year old, between kids born at very different places in the income spectrum, right? And so, if to enable more kids to get access to a high quality preschool, right now there's no mandatory preschool. Obama has proposed it. It's been proposed in different states, including here in Massachusetts. But there's lots of organizations that are enabling kids who couldn't possibly afford to to send their kids to preschool or have any kind of outside the home high quality experience. Organizations that are enabling kids to get these services. So that's one. Another chapter deals with sort of mentorship for kids from typically low income homes who they may have both parents or may not, but the point is they don't really have consistent quality adult role models who are helping them to navigate through the difficult transitions. I mean,
Aren't you glad you grew up when you did and not now?
I am very glad I grew up when I did, and the thing is, as we both know, growing up is hard for a kid of any background, and even with 2 parents. And you put a low income background and 2 parents who are not able to provide in the best means, that what these organizations are doing is providing access to mentorship and job leads as well.
If the parents know how to access them. I find that we're such a transient society now that maybe 20 years ago, 40 years ago, if you were born in California, you were raised in California, you went to the same school. If your parents were in the service, you may have been exposed to different. Now, a child can come from California to Massachusetts overnight.
Right.
And the difference in the education, the difference in the opportunity.
Right.
And likewise, a student from here can go to California, could be smarter than anybody in the room, or could be fallen shot. And I think it's more like a magnifying glass of our society than it used to be when we all pretty much stayed in one place.
Well, of course, it's an irony you're pointing out, right? At a time when geographic mobility is considerably higher than when either of us was growing up, social mobility, right? The likelihood that if you're born kind of in a low-income family, the likelihood that you will the way economists measure this is by quintiles, the 20% of the population, so the richest quintile, the second richest, the middle quintile, the second to lowest, and then the bottom quintile. The likelihood if you're born into the bottom quintile and within a generation reaching one of the top 2 quintiles, which we call social mobility, is much lower now than when we were growing up, but geographic mobility is much higher.
Really? No, I've done some work on Giving Hope, the Gates and Foundation, and the 127 billionaires have signed on to that.
Right.
And the majority of them came from blue collar, working class parents. And that for this day and age, 127 people willing to sign half of it away
Right.
in the behest of the world in general, applause to them.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, it still happens, right? I mean, there's still mobility, but we tend to herald those stories more when they happen, right? And especially when we've got these, these Silicon Valley tycoons, some of whom didn't even graduate college, and that becomes part of their success story, right? The Harvard dropout who makes it big, and Bill Gates. I mean, he's a prototype, and of course, he's the most generous philanthropist that history has ever known. So those stories still exist, but we're talking about aggregates here, right? And again, I mean, I'm hardly the first to say this. We've been hearing news about this pretty much every day, and both political parties have jumped on board the way in which inequality of opportunity has grown, right? And that's really what this book is about. Is saying, what can you or me or any of our viewers do? We're not going to solve it with our own charitable giving, but ways that we can connect to individual people and make their lives dramatically different in a world in which their access to the American dream is eroding. That's really what the book is about.
Now you zero in on news coverage and front page stories, in that a front page story can bring up 70% increase in donations.
Sure.
Good news is hard to peddle.
Right.
Does that mean we as a population respond only to trauma and disaster, and the rest of the time we sort of just walk slowly and wait for the next disaster to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, and this is something psychologists have looked at, and they actually there's a phrase called compassion fatigue, right? And that is, so I mentioned before, one of the things that got me interested in this was Hurricane Katrina being the largest aid effort following a disaster, and including some of the big ones since then. It still is the biggest,
Well,
right?
the oil spill, 2 months later?
Yeah, the oil spill was, but in terms of this, anyway, the point being that there's a point at which we hear bad news and we become a little bit numb to it. The thing that's interesting is how little we hear good news, right? And you think about the way news is by definition about things that are not normal, right? And generally things that are bad tend to be highlighted more things that are good. And so that's part of the motivation for this too, is to say, hey, I mean, in telling these stories of people whose lives have been transformed through giving, of course I'm telling how their lives had been down in the dumps, but people are inspired also by knowing that change is possible. And again, that was another motivator for this book, because I think it's very easy for bad news to feed this sort of this cynicism that there's a huge ocean of need, and my giving is just going to be like a drop of water, and it's not going to do anything.
What do you think of the social media, Facebook, and these fundraising sites that there was a man 2 weeks ago that raised $37,000 to make potato salad?
I think they're fantastic because they play off of these emotions that people have, that they want to see change happen. And social media is very much impulsive, right? And people have been very successful at raising money that way.
I guess.
Right.
Yeah. It surprises me that the world has that much disposable income.
Well, again, it's what's disposable is partially a reflection of our cultural value on giving. I mean, again, as we talked about before, lower income people who you would think don't have much disposable income, they, many of them, of course, a lot of this giving is church-based, and they give what they think is their obligation. But
and 100,000 people giving $1.
Right. And the other thing is that what we're experiencing in the next roughly quarter century is the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in this society. As baby boomers, retire and pass away, they are bequeathing more wealth to their heirs than any prior generation. So there's people who didn't necessarily make it rich on their own or haven't had a tremendous amount of disposable income are going to be are already starting to come into quite a bit. So again, this is a kind of a guide for how people can think about their giving. And I recognize fully this is only one issue. There's lots of terrific issues out there that I don't address, but this one really cuts to the core.
It's a nice start.
Right, it really cuts to the core of who we are as Americans, right? This whole idea of the American dream, that if you work hard, you can get ahead. You can have a better life for yourself and your children. That's the idea that's being imperiled right now.
And how to get there. It's sort of like AAA for
right.
getting out of. I always feel bad for the people that are falling in a manhole, get stuck, get their fingers, just start to, and
Sure.
somebody steps on their hand.
Right.
An income tax person shows up or their car gets crashed.
Right.
They can't seem to get out no matter how hard they try. But thank you, God, the majority of people, there's someone along the way.
The other thing is this book is meant, as you said at the very beginning, as a kind of a teaching resource. So I actually teach a course where I use this book, and it's a course that Framingham State University ran for the first time this past year and will continue to run. And it's part of a kind of a network of similar courses around the country where a foundation gives money to a university, and someone, in this case me, teaches the course. It was $10,000 given to Framingham State University, and my students went through the entire soup to nuts process of identifying worthy causes, asking them to apply for these funds. They set up their focal area was about expanding access to opportunity. The students weren't allowed to support these charities because I felt like I was priming them by the book. These were exemplars.
Well, ain't better that they go find out more resources for you.
Exactly.
That's what
right. Well, it wasn't so much
have
for
to
me,
do.
but there are so many organizations in the greater Boston area that you and I haven't heard of who are doing. I mean, just in every community, and students did the legwork. We ended up getting 20 applications in. They vetted them down to 4. We visited 4 organizations, and then they ended up giving the full $10,000 to an organization in Lowell that's doing gang intervention work and helping kids turn away from gangs and go back to school and get jobs.
Good for them. Congratulations to you and them.
So it's exciting stuff.
Do you go off into grant writing? Because there's a lot of grants out there.
Right.
But grant writing is hard.
It's extremely hard. And I myself don't have particular skill set in grant writing. The course doesn't teach that, but what it does do is we evaluate grants, and there's nothing quite like when you evaluate 20 grant proposals, you really see what makes for a good one versus a mediocre one versus a weak one. So I realize that's a quite valuable skill for students.
Do you think they make it hard, only the constant will get to the end and probably get a grant, somebody who really, really wants it or really needs it? Because they do make it very difficult and very cumbersome to file for grants.
Well, you make a good point, and one of the tensions involved in doing this work is that organizations that might need the money the most
They don't have a grant writer.
aren't as polished, right, to be able to respond. And we talked about that, right? And in this particular case, with teaching this course, it was a very quick turnaround time. They only had about 3 weeks from the time they got invited to apply to actually apply. If you don't have a professional grant writer on staff and you're making it on volunteers and you've got 2 people in a room trying to do 20 hours work and it is a disadvantage. So we talked about that, and that would be a cruel irony if you penalized an organization that needed the money because they didn't have the money to hire a grant writer.
But if you have a good grant writer, even on a volunteer basis, the money that can come in if they know the nuances and which one to check off and which one to not. It's a big benefit to a community, an organization, anything.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. Although it was interesting in evaluating these proposals, the students and I could tell sometimes, even professionals who were doing kind of cut and paste jobs, oh, well, I'll just take, we wanted to see that they were really specifying their request to what we were asking.
Well, I definitely couldn't be a grant writer. I can't even get through my income tax. You have a nice enthusiasm about you. It seems that you learned as much from your students as they learned from you teaching the course.
I think so, and it actually gets back to why I entitled this book "Giving Hope," and that it's a double meaning, right? And the first meaning, maybe the obvious one, is that if you're a person in need and one of these organizations can help you, then my giving to this organization is giving you hope, right?
Yeah.
But the second one connects to what you were asking, and that is in giving or in teaching this class, we actually we gain the hope, right? It gives us hope that what can easily appear in everyday news reporting as an intractable problem where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, we know that script. It actually gives us hope that we can make a difference and individuals' lives can be changed. And when I see my students, their enthusiasm in this course, I mean, just yesterday I got an email from a student who this organization in Lowell I told you that that they supported, she just got hired by them. She just graduated and got hired. She sent me this email, the course was amazing, thank you so much. Now I know that there's something that I'm giving as a result of the course, the book, that there's some
That's good news.
that this work is worth doing. Thank you. Yeah,
That's
I felt very
good
good
news
about that.
and worth touting, and I think
Right.
we're over. Thank you very much for doing it. I will use it as a resource. I will
That's
take
terrific.
it to my librarian and ask her, please to hang it from the ceiling, because I can't imagine it. But I know a lot of nonprofits who will be able to glean from it, from what they can see from both sides, which we don't often get to do.
Terrific. I appreciate your
Thank you
support.
very much for
Thank you
bringing
very
it
much,
to us.
Veronica.
And please come back when you find time to write another one. Or good news about what we've accomplished with this one. That's it for Off the Shelf Books on Tour for today. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Veronica Andrews. My guest has been Ira Silva, and the book is Giving Hope. Bye.